And you can see that it's got these walnut hulls all over it, these walnut balls all over it, and they're the actual nut is in the middle of this. So the actual hard shell is just kind of under the surface of this pulpy stuff here. And it's very stainy. When it gets on your hands, it stains them. And it will stain clothes. It will stain fabric a nice gray color if you boil the fabric in the cooked ball water where the balls have been cooked in. So inside the nut is just regular walnut meat that's very similar to what you would get from store-bought walnuts, which are a different species. This one's native here and has also been cultivated here since prehistoric times. So it's got a very hard nut that you kind of have to crack with a hammer. And one thing you'll notice about it is that it's already losing its leaves. It's already lost a lot of leaves. The leaves hang on basically until the fruit is ripe, and then it's kind of like I'm done gathering energy with these leaves for the year, and drops them. So it's one of the last trees that gets its leaves, and it's one of the first ones that loses them. So it's a good tree to have for shade if you don't want shade in the winter but want it in the summer. You know, the hull, this soft part around the nut is the main part medicinally. Yeah, the nuts can fall with quite a bit of force. Squirrels will also throw them at you if they think you're going to bother their tree or whatever. They will definitely like throw them at you. They bury these, and because the nut is really hard, it takes a long time for them to nibble into it. They will, but they often will go for softer things first. The wood from the walnut's also like used commercially, and kind of really dark hard wood. So anyway, medicinally, it's an astringent, it's an antiseptic, and if you take it internally, it's antiparasitic, basically. And you can also use this to tan leather. If you soak rawhide in a bath made from these walnut hulls, the tannic acid and the gallic acid and other related acids that are in it will chemically change the leather, or the hide into leather. So change it from rawhide into leather. It's kind of like the acid sort of cooking it. But it'll do the same thing to worms that are in your intestines. It'll sort of tan their hide, and that kills them. So that's how it works as an antiparasitic. And you know, nutritionally, the walnut has a lot of fatty acids in it, and good fats, good protein, and some carbohydrates as well. So it's as far as plants go that you can forage around here, it's one of the oiliest things you can find. So if I need something oily and I'm foraging food, a lot of the time I'll get walnuts and either press the oil out of them or just use them in whatever I'm making. So it's a good oil seed, which there are not a lot of just growing in the wild environment around here. Shell bark hickory, or a king nut. It has a very large hickory nut in it. This kind of tree has the biggest, this species of tree, or I don't know, I hesitate to call different types of hickory trees species, but this kind of hickory tree has the biggest hickory nut. They're a little bigger than pecans, or they're as long as pecans but wider. These, so if you crack this open, it's got a really good nut inside it. Cracking it open with a regular nut cracker is kind of hard. Just like with this one, it's trying to protect itself against gray squirrels, which are voracious nibblers. So you know, cracking it with a hammer is easier. You can also make really nice buttons out of this. It's very hard, bony material, and it's very solid. So if you cut it, there's actually 2 holes already in it through it, or you can cut it this way and have a solid surface that you could drill holes in. Buttons are a lot of work to make if you're ever making that sort of thing on your own. You know, compared to a store-bought plastic one, they're definitely, you know, not very, they're very labor intensive. But anyway, this, just like the walnut, has very similar nutrition to what I just said about the walnut, but it's a different type of tree. And these trees look like they've been planted here by somebody, but you can find the same type of tree. People call this a king nut, or the tree shell bark hickory. But hickories freely interbreed with each other, and they have been sort of cultivated in the forests here, grown intentionally by people and planted intentionally by people for thousands of years probably. And so, and they, so they're kind of, it might even make more sense to think of them as cultivars rather than species, since they can all interbreed with each other and produce non-sterile hybrids, and people have been doing that with them on purpose for since time out of mind. But these ones, were probably planted here, and they're mature but not extremely old, I don't think. So anyway, that's another good tree that you can get seeds and, nuts and seed oil from that grows around here. I want to head over this way, see what we see. Chestnuts and persimmon seeds. Is that right? And
that walnut fell from here. Yeah.
And, this is burdock. The root of burdock is edible. The leaves are not really. Some people eat the leaves when they first come out, but I think they're kind of bitter almost right away. I don't really like to eat them, but it has really big leaves. It likes to grow up against buildings, along fences, along edges of woods, things like that. It's very weedy. It produces burrs that will stick to clothing and animal hair. And the roots, the main part we use medicinally. It's a mild tonic for the liver. It's also can be cooked and eaten, and it's a root vegetable. And then this one is poke. When poke is very small like this, you can harvest the leaves and boil them in a couple changes of water and eat them. It's a very traditional food around here. I would say with older people in central Kentucky, if they know one wild edible, it's probably that, even though it's poisonous. And there are many other things that you can just eat without all the processing. But it's prolific, and it'll grow in people's gardens and stuff like that. So it's one that a lot of people know. The root is used medicinally to shrink tumors, but it's also quite poisonous, and not necessarily a great do-it-yourself project or whatever. There's also a bird distributed weedy tree that grows around here, and some adult members of the species have berries and some of them don't. They're not really berries, they're little clusters of fruit that like a raspberry or a blackberry. But if you get a big mulberry tree that bears a lot of fruit, you can get a lot of wild food off of it. And they make nice pies and jams, and I like to make syrup out of mulberries, which is a really good medicine for children that I learned about when I was in Kurdistan. And it's a laxative, and it reduces fevers. So it's kind of a very good tonic for children who often experience fevers and constipation. And then this is our ubiquitous plantain, which is just a weed that grows in everybody's yard. And you can crush up the leaves and use them on wounds. They'll take the sting out of a bee sting pretty dramatically. And they'll also help other wounds close up, and help sunburns to go away and things like that. Although usually I use aloe or something like that instead, but that works if it's what you have. It's in fruit. It's got these little burrs which have hooks on them that can catch on skin, hair, things like that. And then these break apart and fall off or get picked off, and those are the seeds which get planted, get distributed by animals catching them in their hair.
What's the name of that again?
Burdock. And the fruits are called burrs.
I never noticed the
Is that
burrs
where
on
that
them.
came from?
Here is chicory. Chicory has, when it first starts growing, it looks a lot like a dandelion. This is what an individual leaf looks like. Often has a reddish midrib to it, toothed along the edges in varying degrees. And it has a blue flower that opens up in the morning and closes later in the day, and then goes to seed. And unlike dandelions, it has a tall stem that branches. But similar to dandelions, it has a bitter root. Chicory root is kind of famously known for being roasted and used as an ingredient in coffee, or a substitute for coffee. But chicory contains a lot of inulin, which is a starch. We talked about inulin in the context of elecampane, but most of the sunflower family herbs have inulin rather than regular starch in them, in the roots, and it is a good prebiotic. It's something that helps to establish good gut flora, and because it's a bitter herb and a bitter root, it does help with digestion.
Is it too late to harvest them now?
It's too late to harvest this individual one, but there are probably some other ones that it's not.
So if they're still in full bloom?
Yeah, and you know, if they've got the leaves, once they go like this and the seeds are getting ripe, the roots might be kind of spindly and woody. So earlier in the year, it will have more of a root to it before it puts up the whole stem. You said you want to come tell us about this one?
Okay. This is Goldenrod, Latin name Solidago, and the flowers are used in tea or tincture for sinus congestion or to support the liver or kidneys. I believe it is an expectorant and diuretic.
Yep.
And is often blamed for ragweed allergies, but it's not. The pollen is not wind blown.
Very good, very good. This is these are the berries of poke. I've heard a lot of people say that they think these look a lot like elderberries, and like I kind of don't think they do, but they're quite a bit. The individual berries are a little bit bigger, but most importantly, they're arranged in sort of little spikes rather than umbels, rather than being like a umbrella shape. Like an elderberry flower would be arranged sort of in the same shape as this Queen Anne's lace flower, only much larger and on a bush. So poke is not woody, really. It's an herb that this whole thing will die to the ground in the winter. But the berries of poke are poisonous. At least the seeds are poisonous, but they have this just very vivid magenta color that comes out of them. It's not a very color fast color for like dyeing or anything like that. It kind of loses a lot of its it doesn't stick around if you try and dye fabric with it, but you can use it as ink, and it lasts pretty well for that. The seeds are poisonous, but the fruit around the seed is not really. So that's a common strategy with berries, a fairly common strategy with berries, because if munching animals with teeth come along and eat them, and crush up the seeds, it'll make them sick. But if birds eat them and they don't chew anything up, and nothing stays in them for very long, it passes through them very quickly. So they just scatter the seeds everywhere. And that's why this is a very common weed, is because birds, poop the seeds out and take it everywhere that they go. Is Queen Anne's lace, or wild carrot, is basically the same plant as garden carrot, just feral. And it has the seeds promote digestion, get rid of parasites. Some people have used them for contraception, but I'm not entirely sure how effective that is. But they're really good for helping to promote digestion, helping to prevent gas and bloating if they're taken right after a meal. And then the root is edible, although it's usually got kind of a woody core in the middle of it. But the outer part of the root is kind of a lot like a regular carrot, except it's usually white instead of orange. Here, this is during the summer, there's a lot of milkweed that grows here, which is a very important plant for the bees. They really love it. They're always all over it, but now it's going to seed. The seeds you may have seen drifting on the wind. They're these little floofy things that just kind of float around. I think it's a really interesting seed distribution system. It is remotely possible to spin this fluff into some kind of cordage, but it's not easy. We've talked about cherry bark being a cough suppressant, so this is what it grows on. And you know, this same kind of tree can grow into a full-size tree, but you often see it as small seedlings because just like the poke, it has a small pea-sized berry that birds can eat, and then it has a stone in the middle of it that's, you know, it is poisonous if you were to chew it up, but it's basically you know, not very easily chewable. So it gets distributed by birds, and it comes up pretty frequently. It's a native plant, so it's not technically like a weed or an invasive species, but it will often show up in just unmowed fields or alongside buildings and things where lawnmowers and weed eaters don't get to it so much.
So if some of the chicory plant is still flowering out like that, but some of it's not, could you theoretically still harvest the root and use it?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is Calorie Pear, Bradford pear. It's a ornamental pear tree that has become a really invasive species. The fruits are just like this. They're not really edible until they're just about rotten. They go through a two-stage ripening process that a lot of fruits do in the rose family, which is called bledding, where they get ripe, but they're really sour, and then they do what's called bledding, which is like some of the starches turn into sugars and they get really soft and squishy. And at that point, people can harvest them and eat them, but mostly starlings harvest and eat them, and other birds, but especially starlings who travel in large packs and are also an invasive species. But you know, this once again gets distributed by birds because it becomes a soft fruit. And there didn't used to be a lot of these around even in relatively recent times, but in the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, there are more and more every year. And you can see them early in the spring. They'll bloom with white flowers kind of before anything else, and before any of the other trees before most of the trees have leaves on them or anything. This is a multifloral rose, which you can also very often find on places like this that are farms that have not been, that people have stopped working, overgrown pastures and things like that. So the rose hips persist well into the later part of the year. If you want to use rose hips, they're a good source of vitamin C. The rose hips on multifloral rose don't have a lot of rose hip to them. I mean, they're mostly seeds, but you can cook them, kind of stew them, get a bunch of them and stew them, and then sort of mash the whole thing up and strain out the seeds and skins and make a sort of rose hip jam or rose hip butter out of that can be preserved. It's kind of like a jelly or an apple butter type of thing. If you want it to be more like jelly, you'd have to add some pectin to it. If you don't, it'll be more like apple butter. A little oak tree, something in the black oak section of the genus. I'm not sure what exactly, maybe red oak, but there's lots and lots of species of oak trees. They all make acorns, but they're not all that different from each other. So this one doesn't have any acorns on it. Bigger ones do, but this one's nice because I can say, here are the leaves instead of them being 20 feet out. So Yeah, this will grow in, this could grow into a very large tree and live for hundreds of years. And so most oak trees will make acorns some years and not make acorns some years. The bark is used medicinally from oak trees, and with that you can have the rough outer bark from large branches. It contains tannins, tannic acids. The main thing I use it for is I keep some in my medicine wagon when I'm doing first aid in case I need to induce vomiting, because it will like really not just induce vomiting, but you can like it kind of washes out the inside of the stomach and is a good way to get, if somebody has taken too much medicine, to get it back out of them. And it will also inactivate and interfere with quite a lot of medicines, so you don't want to take it along with most things. Other than that, it's used topically quite a bit, which is it's just antiseptic, and it helps wounds to close up, helps firm up the skin around wounds so that they close up better and heal better. Hey Ben. I just got some new oak bark from a branch that fell out at my mom's house, but for the past 4 years I've been using oak bark from the same log, that fell and that I peeled bark off of, and it's, not something I use a whole lot, but it's something that it keeps basically forever. It doesn't have any aromatic compounds in it and stuff, so you will get a bit of a stronger product from the bark with most types of oak trees, but that varies because some oak trees are the acorns are a lot more astringent than others.
You talked in one of our classes about using a small piece of a small young tree rather than getting bark off an older tree if you didn't have one that was down, like you said.
Yeah. So I mean, depending on what you have, you can either, and I mean,
like if that was your friend right there.
Yeah.
Would you?
I would just
take
let
parts
it
of
go.
it.
No, I wouldn't really try to harvest bark from something this small,
Okay.
because I think that it would just, likely kill it. So, with small trees, if you're harvesting from small trees, it's usually just a good idea to take the whole tree and get the bark off of it, which I wouldn't really usually do with oak trees because I like the bark from bigger trees better. But with a cherry tree, I would. With a sassafras tree, I might just take if there were a bunch of small trees, just take one small tree or a couple small trees instead of pruning from a big tree, which might damage, a bigger, older tree.
And then
this food, a lot of us were raised with the impression that acorns are quite poisonous, but they're not really. But if you get too much of them, they will make you vomit because of the astringency. But if you take acorns and take the shells off, beat the nuts up into small pieces, and then either soak that in several changes of water or soak it in flowing water, which is something that people used to do, is just, put it in a bag and put the bag into the creek, hang the bag into the creek from a branch. The trouble with doing that is, you're likely to contaminate it with runoff from cattle fields or, poison the fish in the creek or whatever. So, but just soaking it in multiple changes of water, for, letting it soak in water for a day or so and then changing the water and doing that multiple times till it's not making the water brown anymore. That's the most important part. Then you can take the mushed up bits of acorn and you can either cook them like a porridge or you can dry them out and grind them into flour at that point. Cypress trees, and they get like this, it's not necessarily a problem, but these can grow into absolutely massive trees. They're one of our native conifers here in Kentucky. There's one or two species. They're probably actually all the same species, but there's bald cypress, which is this, and then there's pond cypress, which looks a little bit different and grows in more stagnant waters. But they're probably actually the same species, just growing with different genetics and different conditions. But yeah, these are small ones. There's another one. There's a couple more back there. But these can grow into very large trees. And they have, rather than having a normal looking pine cone, they have like a ball that is its cone. It has the scales and the seeds, you know, sort of a fleshy ball.
Why is it that color?
Why is it that color? Well, because there's not enough light for it to photosynthesize, so it's just sucking the magnesium and the minerals out of the chlorophyll and storing them elsewhere, just like deciduous trees do. It is deciduous, yeah, just like broadleaf trees do. It's not evergreen, even though it's a conifer.
Yeah, what are those? I get those on myself all the
They're
time.
in the bean family, and they have like a little clover or bean type flower. These are actually like little tiny edamames, but they stick to your clothes.
Yes, they do.
But if you get them when they're green and you split it open and you eat the little bean that's inside, it tastes just like a tiny edamame.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. There are green ones right now. Yeah. Pick them off the cat and eat
I like
them.
seeing them with green ones on them.
Yeah.
Come here, kitty. Next time.
Which we saw last time. So it's a very common, it's often one of the first trees to grow back after an area has been plowed or bulldozed or something like that. So if you drive down the highway, you'll see lots of them. They can stay this size for a really long time, or they can get pretty big too. You know, like I said before, when people who spoke English came to this area, they just started naming stuff the names of old things. And I think in North America, they named like 4 different trees cedar, 3 or 4 different trees cedar. So a lot of the time now you'll see this specified as Eastern red cedar, but it's not a cedar at all. I mean, it's a juniper really, but the people who named it, they knew about cedar trees. They'd read about cedar trees in the Bible or heard them mentioned, but they didn't really know what they were like exactly. They just knew that it was some sort of an aromatic coniferous tree. And so this was that, and so they just started calling them cedar trees.
So it has like the little blue berry looking thing.
Yeah, yeah. So the real cedars look more like the cypress that we saw over there, but they have a different. These have like kind of spiky, short spiky needles on them, and they do get little berries.
Can you eat the berries?
They're mostly wooden inside, and yeah,
Are they?
birds do. You can, but there's not much food to them, and they taste very
Gross.
piney. And like, you know, which is, I mean, a lot of people don't like that flavor.
But they make a nice little aromatic if you
Yeah.
boil them on the stove.
Yeah, they are aromatic, and people do like cook venison with them to get that flavor in with it, and that sort of thing. Same thing as burdock, but it also has burrs on it. It has a similar strategy for distributing its seeds, which are these little burrs, and they kind of velcro to each other very nicely. But yeah, if you're looking for burdock, be careful not to mistake this plant for it. They're not the same. This is a willow tree. Oh, this is a willow tree. This is a branch that just came off a willow tree. Sorry. And that's one too over there. They've got these really skinny leaves, and they love to grow in really mushy places. Damp ditches and ponds. They will grow in ponds sometimes. So willow is really well known in the herbal medicine world for containing anti-inflammatory substance called salicin, which is named after Salix. And it's kind of similar to the drug aspirin, which is acetyl salicylic acid. but this is the bark is the main part that's known for containing it, although the leaves have nearly as much. So either one can be used medicinally. The leaves are a little more astringent tasting. The bark is not like that, but it's an anti-inflammatory, pain reliever, and fever reducer. And it, in the form that it's in willow, it's not really a clotting inhibitor. Some salicylates, some similar chemicals, substances in plants do inhibit clotting. Willow doesn't very much at all, if at all. But it is a good thing to have around as a pain reliever, and potentially as a fever reducer. I don't really ever use it to reduce fevers, because most of the time I'm not trying to reduce fevers, but also there are a lot of other things that do that pretty well, including just, wiping the skin down with a cold, wet washcloth. But it will help with that if needed, and it's a pretty decent pain reliever.
Is there a benefit to using the leaf versus the bark, vice versa?
The main difference between the two is that the leaves have more astringency than the bark. So if it was a situation where that's what you were going for.
Gotcha.
Now this is one that you would have taken a smaller tree, right?
Yeah, you could definitely take smaller trees of this, because willow, a neat thing about willow is that if you were to cut this right at the ground, the roots that are under it will send up a few more small trees.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can like harvest willow by cutting a bunch of small trees from the same spot year after year. I mean, if you don't, you want to have enough of you can't harvest all of them every year, but you could harvest, say, a third of them every year, and you'd have a steady supply of willow bark and small sticks. And so that's that technique. It's called coppicing. In Irish, it's called gari sale, and it's like a willow gardening, and it's just like a really a common way that people traditionally got small pieces of wood for, not like weight-bearing construction, but maybe for basketry, for holding up their roofs with thatch, and for like tool handles, broom handles, things like that, and also fencing, fences.
But it's not the same as the weeping willow, correct?
Well, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of willow,
Mm-hmm.
and weeping willows are part of that. But
Do they still have the same?
they still have the stuff in the bark. Yeah, they do still have
So
medicinal
if
bark.
I have two large weeping willow trees that don't seem to be sending out a lot of young. I see some shoots coming off of the main bark.
Mhm.
So what would be the best way to either start a new tree for it, help it get started, or to harvest something like that?
I'm not sure about helping a new tree get started, but a lot of the time they have long, not really tendrils, but long pieces that hang down, and you can harvest those, and it will make more of them.
Okay.
The base of the stem is always really muddy, but because that's where they live. But the base of the stem is edible. Tastes kind of like cucumber. If you dig out the roots, which is a real hassle to do in most places, because it's often deep down in the mud, you can wash the roots, and you can get starch out of them. I've done it once, and it was enough of a hassle that I didn't ever do it again. But it is definitely something that people sometimes do. So the root starch is in the roots, and then at the base of the stem there's like edible plant material, and then of course further up it's more grass-like and not something that a person could eat.
So I recently learned that those little hot dog looking seed pods at the end, it's was it the female or the male, do you remember? Have you read that chapter yet? Anyway, you can eat them almost like a corn on the cob.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they're supposedly, according to the author, they're delicious.
Green. Yeah, I have not tried that.
The pollen's really good.
The pollen, you can gather a lot of pollen from
I've
them.
never bit into the corn dogs. I've never tried
Who's
that.
the brave soul that's going to do that today?
I was going to try it, but my husband burned ours down last week without consulting me.
deep fry some cattail. Eat.
That certain plants tend to develop certain leaf coloration. Sometimes they just turn brown, but for example, a lot of oaks will develop this reddish kind of color. Whereas if you look over there, I can't really see the leaves of that tree from this distance, but I can tell from that peachy orange color that it's going to be a maple tree. So you can often recognize fall foliage by the color, and it will often be consistent within a species. This is what poison hemlock looks like when it's dead for the year. It can be really tall and has jointed stems and sort of umbel-shaped flowers. You can usually see like they're splotchy, even though the color's all gone out of it. Sumac, and it looks a lot like a little walnut tree, but it's red. And instead of nuts, it has these things, which are I call them berries. They're not berries at all. They're like these little hard fuzzy things. They look like berries, but sometimes they're very sour. Sometimes they're just a little bit sour. You can make you can't really eat them because of the texture, but you can make a beverage out of them. You can make a tea out of them that's usually a little bit sour and refreshing. You'll find them on here all winter long pretty much. So this tree, this shrub, whatever you want to call it, sometimes it gets like 15 feet tall or whatever, but it doesn't get really big. It doesn't get like actually tree sized. You know, so it'll have like, if it has a trunk this big around and it's, you know, 15 feet tall or so, that's a really big one. A lot of the time it's just like this. There are a few different species of it here. Medicinally, they're all pretty much interchangeable, except the ones with white berries. That's poison sumac. Don't touch it. But you won't even see it probably. It lives in the swamp, and it's not common around here if it even lives in this part of the state at all. I've never seen it in central Kentucky. But yeah, this is you know, green, and then it fades to this dark purplish red color, and it has the red sumac on it. Sumac, the fuzz from sumac is used in Middle Eastern cooking as well, as a spice. It'll often grow in clumps like this, where there's just sort of a stand of it growing along the edge of the trail or in some similar space.
So a friend gave me some of the powder, like I guess the spice powder. Is it the whole seed ground up, or is it just that fuzzy red part?
I think it's just the fuzzy red part from the outside of it. Like,
it's really delicious and tangy. Like, we put it on rice.
yeah.
So, yeah.
This character here is Sycamore tree, and you can it's got a very distinctive leaf shape, and the leaves get really big. They get even quite a bit bigger than this sometimes, and they'll often be fuzzy on one side. And so when sycamore is a mature tree, the upper branches of it will be just bone white, just completely white, and then the trunk will be like a sort of a lacy, will be brown with pieces that peel off and expose white underneath. I don't really use sycamore very much medicinally. The bark, the white bark of it is an extremely strong laxative, but I don't usually like to use extremely strong laxatives. No one enjoys their effects. The only times I use it are when someone has, if somebody's been on opiates and then come off of them and is constipated as a result of that, then it can be appropriate to do a dose of it. But the thing that I like about sycamore, they often grow in a particular type of soil usually, which is like the flood depositions from creeks. they don't always grow there, but anytime you find like the sides of a creek or a river or whatever, you'll usually find sycamores growing there. And so they're kind of part of that ecosystem. They're sort of a way you might see that ecosystem from a distance away, because they've got the white branches and they're very visible. And vultures like to perch in the branches because it's usually a good overlook of the creek, and they can find dead fish or whatever. And nettles will often grow in the shade of them because they like that kind of environment too. And so it's, for me, more of a marker species or kind of a keystone species for a particular ecosystem than something I directly use medicinally, although it does have medicinal uses. But like I said, I seldom really have occasion for that. The wood is also very whittleable. If you whittle, it's very you can carve shapes into it without it splitting or cracking apart. So it's good for that. It's easy to recognize. It has beans on it, you can see back in here, and it has heart-shaped leaves. Only tree in town that has beans and heart-shaped leaves. Early in the spring, it will have bright pink flowers growing on it that you can see a mile away. They grow on the branches. They grow right on the trunk, like flowers growing directly out of the trunk. And they grow out like this too, where the beans are now. The beans are really too hard to eat, but the flowers taste just like beans and are edible. And sometimes people make jelly or something out of them, or I just usually use them as an edible thing, like in salads. But they're pretty and they taste good. The birch tree has kind of papery bark that peels off. Not all birches have that, but a lot of them do. And the bark contains stuff that will help reverse sun damage. So you can make a water extract of the bark and apply it daily to sun damaged skin, and it can help to actually get it back to normal. I've often used it. I've often used an extract of it for people who have had skin cancers removed, just to use on skin where there isn't any obvious sign of cancer, but where in areas that are kind of more risky, like along the hairline, there is where they often will show up. Where squamous and basal cell carcinomas will often show up, just sort of to kind of help heal the skin in those areas. The bark, the smaller bark, has also got anti-inflammatory stuff in it, similar to what's in willow. These are some millet type grasses. I don't know the exact species of these, because there are several different ones, but they contain grains that can be combed out of them pretty easily. And as far as actual grains that are growing around here, these are probably the easiest ones to gather. You can actually put a bunch of these in a paper bag and just kind of shake it, or leave them in there for several days and then shake it, and a lot of these will fall out, and that can be an easier way to gather them. A lot of the time I'll just pick one of these and eat the grains from it.
Whoa, horse kind.
So it's feeling the cold weather and it's like, oh, it's springtime? Great, I'll flower.
Oh no.
See, it's got some flowers going on.
Poor little thing.
It's,
So confused.
Get it while you can.
yeah, maybe it'll be able to make flowers and
Get it for
beans by the winter time. I don't know. If not, oh well. But you'll try again next year. But yeah, sometimes when it gets cool like this, some spring things flower. Try and get a little bit of blooming done before it's too late. But that's an unexpected example of what these look like. bushes. You can see they have a sort of a star-shaped cross-section, or like grooves that run along the length of the canes. The roots of blackberries are very astringent, can be used to stop diarrhea because of their astringency. The leaves can be made into a tea. It's a little more sour than a raspberry leaf tea, but is also pretty nutritive. This is basically a giant weird mulberry. It's called hedge apple or Osage Orange. You've all seen these things before probably. Recently they've started making some cosmetic products out of the oil of the seeds of this. It's not really edible, but the bark of the root is medicinal. The wood is very springy and has been used for making bows and some other tools. But the bark of the root is papery, and it is blaze orange. And it'll peel off just like birch bark will, but it's like highway department orange. And if you make a sterile water-based extract of that, you can use it as an eye wash for conjunctivitis, pink eye, and that sort of thing.
What is that again?
It is Osage Orange. It's the tree
I have
that these
seen
things
the
grow
name.
on. Yeah.
Okay. And where did you find it? I'm sorry, I was back.
I found
You
it
just
on
picked- Oh, I
this.
see it up there.
I see
Okay.
it on this
Cool.
thorny little tree.
Is it meant to be like
Oh, wood. Yes. Yes.
Our son made a nice bow out of it.
Aoife made an Osage Orange bow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It works well.
The fibers
You were
are
10.
twisted around each
Is
other.
that bow making can?
Oh.
Warty Bark. That's a hackberry tree, and you often find them growing right where that one is, like along fence lines. They have little tiny berries. The berries are good for about 1 day. They have about 1 day where they're not sour and not rotten, and they taste good on that day. But you can also cook the berries and make a syrup or other medicinal product from them for coughs. And they're more expectorant and less cough suppressant than the cherry bark tree. I don't really use them for anything, but they always grow on that particular type of tree, on locust trees. So if it doesn't have any ones we looked at before, and you can see that the ends of the leaves here are rounded instead of ending in little spiky type bristles. These ones are rounded at the ends. So same, everything about it's the same, but you laughing at me? Its medicinal properties are the same, but the amount of astringency is going to be different, and usually less for that. Has a little bit of a
No,
different,
but I mean,
Raspberry.
in the
stem than the blackberries here, but which has a waxy powder coating that rubs off and is otherwise pretty smooth and round. Has a round cross section rather than a star-shaped cross section. This is a black raspberry. Sometimes it will bear a few fruits late in the year, but mostly it's mostly first half of June is when you'd find fruit on it. But like with the blackberry, the leaves can be made into tea, which is also nutritive. Doesn't have a lot of calories in it, but it has minerals and vitamin C.
Does it have some of the tonifying properties
Yeah,
you
it
would
does.
expect from any raspberry?
I use it just like how I used to buy it from the co-op. Now I just harvest